Hey everyone, welcome to the Council of Trent podcast. I'm your host, Catholic Answers apologist Trent Horn.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Catholics Against Militarism podcast. My name is Ellen Finnegan and I'll be your host.
It's been nearly 80 years since the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan during the end of World War II. Those would be the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In today's episode, I want to talk about whether this action was moral or whether it was gravely immoral, and that's still controversial among many Catholics.
It's been nearly 30 years since John Paul II wrote his encyclical on Christian morality, Veritatis Splendor, in which he proclaims, "Following Christ is thus the essential and primordial foundation of Christian morality. Jesus asks us to follow him and to imitate him along the path of love, a love which gives itself completely to the brethren out of love for God. Quote, 'This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you.' John 15:12. The word 'as' requires imitation of Jesus. Jesus' way of acting and his words, his deeds, and his precepts constitute the moral rule of Christian life. Interestingly, Veritatis Splendor was published on August 6th, which is the same day that the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima.
But before I do that, I hope you'll like this video, subscribe to our channel, and support us at TrentHornPodcast.com.
You can like this video and subscribe to my channel, or better yet, just go subscribe to me over at Rumble, because I've already got 2 community strikes on this platform, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to get kicked off real soon.
No jokes about that because, well, today's topic is pretty grim.
It is pretty grim, but I just wanted to say thanks to Trent Horn for actually doing this episode and talking about this topic. I listen to a lot of Catholic podcasts, and so few of them actually talk about war or violence in any way. So, Trent Horn, thank you for talking about this. I'm doing this kind of cheeky back and forth, but I'm really mostly going to be responding with a few of my own thoughts, but most of my comments will come from Father Emmanuel Charles McCarthy's book, All Things Flee Thee, for Thou Fleest Me, or Just War Theory, The Logic of Deceit.
So let's put out some facts about the bombings, and then I'll give a moral analysis. So on August 6th and 9th, 1945, the United States detonated 2 atomic bombs over the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, respectively. The bombings killed between 129,000 and 226,000 people, most of whom were civilians. It's the only use of nuclear weapons in an armed conflict.
Just thought I would add that between 1939 and 1945, Allied planes dropped 3.4 million tons of bombs on Axis powers. Between 70 and 85 million people around the world died in the Second World War. The numbers I got said that 15 million were military casualties and 38 million were civilian casualties. When you're talking about these kinds of numbers, I guess it's add or subtract 10 million here or 10 million there. They don't really add up, but the point being that there were about 2 or 3 civilians killed for every person in the military.
Japan surrendered to the Allies on August 15th, 6 days after the bombing of Nagasaki. This reenactment from the BBC does a good job of dramatizing the bombing itself and showing how the bomb exploded in the air over the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to cause maximum damage. About half of the victims were killed during the first day of the bombing, and the rest died of burns, infections, and radiation poisoning over the next few months. Here's how one survivor of the bombing describes the aftermath.
They saw things no person should witness.
There were already a number of people that were dead along the roadside. People were burned, suffering, and then, begging for a drink of water. Some of the injuries were so severe that, for example, people with burns, their skins would be dripping from their bodies. And some of the people actually had broken limbs, protruding. When we came back after the surrender, we came back to the same area, and the whole city was completely flat. It was really devastating to see.
Catholics tend to hold one of 2 positions on this issue. Recent popes like Francis, Benedict, and John Paul II have condemned the bombings and have often prayed at the site of the attacks when they visit Japan. Catholic theologians who criticize the bombing cite St. Paul's condemnation of the idea that we can do evil, that good may come. That's in Romans 3:8. And the Second Vatican Council, which says, any act of war aimed indiscriminately at the destruction of entire cities of extensive areas along with their population is a crime against God and man himself. It merits unequivocal and unhesitating condemnation, end quote. The argument on the other side of the debate...
Whoa, hold on, let's slow down. So the Catholic theologians that object to the dropping of the atomic bombs do so because of reference to something written during Vatican II or shortly thereafter, and something written in St. Paul. It's interesting that no one's talking about Jesus here. What about John L. Mackenzie? He, according to Wikipedia, was the premier Catholic theologian of the mid-20th century. And he wrote that the just war theory of Christianity was, quote, a piece of phony morality, unquote. A piece of phony morality. He might draw our attention to something, certainly what Jesus did and what Jesus said, but also what St. Paul wrote in Colossians 2:8. Make sure that no one traps you and deprives you of your freedom by some second-hand, empty, rational philosophy based on the principles of this world instead of on Christ. I think what I'm trying to point out here is that there are plenty of Catholic theologians and thinkers who would object to the dropping of an atomic bomb, not because it's atomic in nature or because of the scale of the destruction, but because they object to, the just war theory itself. I know they're a minority, and Trent Horn, to be fair, would probably say, Ellen, this is not what that video is about. That's a separate video. Fair enough. However, I see this happening all the time in Catholic conversations. That whole part of it gets left out. What happens is they start arguing on the basis of the just war theory. And the minute you do that, you narrow everything down, which is why what he's talking about, he's saying that the Catholic theologians who are against the dropping of the bomb are opposing it on the grounds of the just war theory, right? It's disproportionate violence, or it kills too many civilians, or you're only supposed to bomb a small area of a city, not a big area of a city. And so all of a sudden you're talking within these terms. They're not objecting to the dropping of an atomic bomb based on the teachings of Jesus. And I guarantee that when he flips to the other side, certainly no one's going to be able to justify the dropping of the bomb on the basis of anything Jesus said or did. And the reason for that, the reason Jesus is completely left out of this conversation, is because the just war theory itself owes nothing to what Jesus ever said or ever did. And so do you see the danger there? And all of a sudden we're just like narrowing it down to this very narrow view of the issue. And the most important thing is getting left out.
The argument on the other side of the debate is that the atomic bombings were necessary to prevent a greater loss of life that would have resulted from the Allies invading the Japanese mainland.
Literally the argument for every single thing ever done in war. It was necessary to prevent something that would have been worse. The problem with that is that you can never prove that, right? You can never prove something that would have happened in the future that never actually happened. But anybody can make up an argument to say that something is necessary. So I'm just going to skip the next part of the video where somebody from Prager Institute makes an argument saying it was necessary, because it's always this, it's one thing or another, but at the end of the day, it's the same argument.
So who's right? I side with Catholic philosophers like Father John Ford, Elizabeth Anscombe, and Edward Feser, along with the popes and the magisterium, who say the bombings were not justified because morality does not allow us to do something that is intrinsically evil in order to achieve a good end or prevent a greater evil.
So to drop an atomic bomb is an intrinsic evil. But what about the 3.5 trillion tons of bombs that were dropped before these two bombs were dropped? Those were not intrinsically evil. So it's not intrinsically evil to kill 75 million people. I'd love to hear him talk more about intrinsic evil versus evil and how we know which kind of evil we can do. I'm really curious. I'm genuinely curious. I'm not trying to be snarky. I just really don't understand. And also, along the same lines, what makes it intrinsically evil? Is it just the size of the bomb? So if it kills, what's the number of people that a bomb can kill when it becomes intrinsically evil? If it'll kill, like 200, it's not intrinsically evil, but like if it'll kill 2,000, it is. Is that the standard? What about like white phosphorus that we used in Vietnam, or like Agent Orange? Is it the effect that it has on the human being that makes it intrinsically evil versus just regular evil or not evil? You know what I mean? Like, because white phosphorus, melts people's skin and sticks to them and burns them. And Agent Orange can also cause like genetic problems and bladder cancer 50 years later. And I mean, there's all kinds of terrible things that we drop on people, right? Uranium in Iraq. So is it just the number of people who are immediately killed and the size of the bomb? Is that what makes it intrinsically evil? Or is it the effect? Like when you're talking about 3.5 trillion tons of bombs that were dropped and 75 million people killed, to say that, oh, but these 2 bombs are intrinsically evil. Come on, really? I'm not trying, it doesn't make sense to me. And it can't, sorry, I'm going to shut up soon and let him talk again, but it can't be just the civilian thing either. Like, oh, this killed so many civilians. Well, 2 out of every 3 people that died in this war were civilians. So that can't be the standard. So what is the standard that makes something intrinsically evil? And why is intrinsically evil this big no-no? And why do we distinguish that from just plain old evil? Are we allowed to do evil? Come on. Trent Horn, I need you to answer some of these questions, please. And if the dropping of certain bombs is intrinsically evil, like atomic bombs intrinsically evil, fire bombs, it could be evil, it could not be evil, depends on the motivation and the circumstances, whatever. Do we have to now do that as part of this just war theory for every kind of weapon? Like, we use the drones and it's intrinsically evil if they do this, but it's not intrinsically evil if they do that. What about satellite war? What about Star Wars? What about space stuff? What about like submarines? Like, are there certain things, like, do you see what I'm saying? If now we have, there's a whole category of bombs, but now we have certain bombs that are intrinsically evil, but others aren't. And I think it comes down to the number of people, which means that just war, like Catholic just wars, would be just fine if you killed 75 million people with 75 million bombs. That's not intrinsically evil because you're just doing it one at a time. But if you dropped one bomb and killed 75 million people at once, intrinsically evil. I guess that's the logic. I don't know.
Morality allows us to cause bad things to happen under limited circumstances, but it doesn't let us commit intrinsic evils.
There he goes again. Okay, so 74 million people died. That's just a bad thing that happened. These 200,000 people die, intrinsic evil. I guess the 74 million people was some kind of limited circumstances. It was only 3% of the world's population, so it was limited.
For example, it's not wrong to bomb an enemy radar station in the middle of the night, even if you know a civilian at the station, like a janitor, will probably be killed. You don't intend the innocent man's death, and you'd be relieved if you found out he just didn't show up to work that night. But you can't intentionally target civilians in a war for the purpose of using their deaths for some greater good.
They were carpet bombing entire cities. Of course, they invented the term collateral damage, right? Like, oh, I didn't intend to kill the civilians. I knew that they were down there. I knew they were going to die. But I didn't mean for them to die. That's where they come up with the whole collateral damage thing to kind of make the loophole around intention, right? Like, oh, I didn't mean it. So there's like a wedding party with 200 people there, and there's one guy who's a bad guy, so you drone strike the whole party and kill everybody, and it's like, oh, I didn't mean to kill everybody, I just meant to kill him. Not intrinsically evil, I guess. Totally fine.
If we say the bombings were justified because they produced the best consequence overall, then we've entered the realm of consequentialist morality, specifically utilitarian morality.
Truman's use of the bomb should be seen as his choosing the least awful of the options available to him.
If your moral standards boil down to supporting whatever action produces the best outcome, then you'll abandon the idea of intrinsic evils, or actions that can never be done, no matter the consequences. Catholics understand this when it comes to abortion, but often fail to apply it to war. For example, I don't understand Catholics who say you cannot directly kill a child through abortion, even to save the mother's life, but you can use atomic bombs to save soldiers' lives. When it comes to abortion, they'll say that even if both mother and child will die if no abortion is performed, you still can't perform the abortion. Even if you have a choice where two people will die and another choice where only one person dies, you can't pick the one person if that choice requires directly killing an innocent person. But then some of those same Catholics will say the atomic bombs were justified because it was the only way to prevent more people from dying in an invasion of Japan.
Yeah, and women who go to get abortions will oftentimes say that, I didn't want to, my goal was not to kill another person. My goal was to end my pregnancy. That's what I wanted to do. The death of the baby was simply collateral damage. That wasn't my main goal. I didn't set out to go kill my baby. I wanted to end my pregnancy. This was my goal, my intention, and that's collateral damage of me doing this thing. They also will justify it. It's the same justification. They'll say, if I don't have an abortion, something bad will happen. Something worse will happen than killing the baby. And in your view, you might say, oh, that's terrible. There's nothing worse than a baby dying. But in their view, there is something worse and it's necessary. So they just simply make an argument to say it's necessary to prevent a greater evil. The child will suffer. The child will have a genetic disease. The child will live in poverty. The child, won't have an optimal situation growing up. So they just say there's a worse evil that will happen if I don't do this. It's the same exact logic.
They say there was one choice where many people die and another choice where fewer people die. So they simply choose the one where fewer people die, even though that choice involves directly killing innocent people.
They don't always choose the one where fewer people die, by the way. So you say you have somebody who's in prison for life for a terrible crime. Many Catholics will say, yeah, that person should be put to death. You could have 0 more people die by not putting them to death, but they will opt to put the person to death as a punishment for what the person did. So they don't always choose the least amount of people to die.
You can't directly kill an unborn child, even to save his mother's life. You can't directly kill the mother to save the child. But apparently, from their perspective, you could kill many unborn children through an atomic bomb. I'm sure many did die to save many soldiers' lives. It just doesn't make sense.
No, Trent, it doesn't make sense. And, I just wish Jesus would have left us with some clearer idea of who we can kill and under what circumstances. I just wish he would have because this is a big deal. This has been going on since Cain and Abel. Killing. And it's we have to have Jesus, I wish he would have said, you can kill these people under these circumstances, and you have only if you have these intentions, and it has to be this number, and you can't burn them to death or radiate them to death. You have to, kill them immediately. I just wish he would have addressed this issue. It's weird that he didn't address it at all, and so we're just left in this mass cloud of confusion, trying to figure it out. Gosh, I wish he would have said something about that.
If you embrace this consequentialist morality, by the way, you also lose the ability to call anything a war crime. Because the military could always say, yeah, that was bad, but we were just trying to save lives by ending the war sooner. These could be things like exclusively targeting civilian populations or centers like hospitals or preschools, torturing prisoners of war to get information,
which America has been doing for 20 years, but let's face it, let's be realistic, probably longer.
Or to pressure the enemy to surrender, purposely destroying religious or cultural artifacts to reduce enemy morale. The list goes on. The United Nations says that one kind of war crime includes intentionally directing attacks against the civilian population as such, or against individual civilians not taking direct part in hostilities, end quote. We're better at recognizing war crimes when they're committed against us. For example, imagine if the Nazis had dropped an atomic bomb on Pittsburgh. Would we have considered that just another battle in the war that was meant to hinder our steel production? Or would we have called it a war crime that was meant to terrorize American citizens? And here's 2 other examples from the conflict with Japan. Between 1944 and 1945, Japan sent 1,000 balloon bombs into the jet stream with the goal of starting forest fires in the U.S. and causing panic. Now, the U.S. Office of Censorship was aware of the bombs' panic-inducing potential and concealed news reports about them exploding on American soil. Fortunately, the bombs did not cause widespread destruction. But one that landed in Oregon killed the pregnant wife of a local minister and 5 of her Sunday school students.
What about the janitor? Sorry, I know that's not funny. It's terrible, but I couldn't help myself.
They were the only American civilian casualties in the continental United States during World War II. Do you feel that it was wrong for the Japanese to send a bomb over to the U.S. for the sole purpose of causing fear, widespread destruction like forest fires among civilians? If so, then you should probably be against the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
And all 3.5 trillion or billion or million tons of bombs dropped in World War II.
And here's something that could have happened in the U.S. if Japan had not surrendered in August. In 1945, the Japanese Surgeon General Shiroishi planned to release balloons and bombs carrying plague-infected fleas over California coastal cities in an attack called Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night.
One of the experiments involves testing the effects of bubonic plague on humans. And a plan is hatched to develop a bomb that would release the plague into an enemy's population. The idea is that the plague-infected fleas will infect rats and spread the bubonic plague. The prime target, California. The question is, how to deliver a plague bomb over an ocean. One solution? Balloon bomb. But there's another method at the Japanese disposal. The bombs can be carried by aircraft launched from submarine aircraft carriers.
Japanese, the only country in the world to have submarine aircraft carriers during the Second World War. And this really was a very serious threat. These planes could be fitted with these special ceramic bombs and used to bomb Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego.
Firebombs dropped on Tokyo from planes, not intrinsic evil. Bug bombs dropped from ceramic canisters from submarines, definitely intrinsic evil. I think I'm starting to get this now.
The war ends before any plague bomb is used. But would the plot really have gone ahead?
If the operation had been put into practice, it would have worked. And I think the devastation caused in American cities would have been truly terrifying. Thousands of people would have been infected with plague. Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night is probably one of the least known but most amazing and potentially horrendous operations undertaken by any of the belligerent powers in the Second World War.
Now, the attack was canceled after Japan surrendered in August, but cities like San Diego were, and still are, prominent bases of military operations. But using a weapon that indiscriminately targets civilians with a painful, agonizing death being covered in boils and vomiting blood, as would happen with plague, that'd be a war crime. But that's the kind of death that the atomic bomb inflicted upon people at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, who died of burn injuries and radiation poisoning in the days and weeks after the attacks.
But if you're a soldier laying in a field, suffering from a long, slow, agonizing death, I mean, we've all heard the stories of World War I, and even the stories of the Civil War, where, you could actually hear the maggots, crawling around and, eating people at night. I've heard these stories before. That's actually fine. That's fine. Jesus would approve of that. As long as they're not civilians, it's not intrinsically evil.
Now, this brings me to the first of 3 arguments that are used to justify the bombings. The first is that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were fair game because they had extensive military installations, and so the civilian deaths were a tragic unintended effect of attacking a legitimate military target.
Truman sought to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 2 major military industrial targets, to avoid an invasion of Japan, which Truman knew would mean, in his words, quote, an Okinawa from one end of Japan to the other, end quote.
But the killing of civilians in these cases was an intended effect of the bombs. This can't be justified under double effect. If the cities had been evacuated for some reason, a different target would have been chosen. Declassified documents show that planners were advised, quote, to neglect location of industrial areas as pinpoint target, since such areas are small, spread on fringes of cities and quite dispersed, and to place first gadget, bomb, in center of selected city for complete destruction. Now, you could justify using an atomic bomb on a naval fleet, for example, where civilian casualties are minimal.
Sure, Jesus would totally drop a nuclear bomb on a naval fleet. Let's see. Simple Christians are aware that Jesus' teachings of nonviolent love of friends and enemies are easy to understand but hard to live. They also know that Christ, God, in his infinite mercy, always forgives any failure in living according to his teachings if we but ask. However, it takes sophisticated theological savvy to arrive at the conclusion that Jesus' teachings of nonviolent love of friends and enemies are not only unclear, confusing, archaic, non-normative, and not what he really meant, but are also supportive of homicidal violence. Such thinking is madness clothed in the paraphernalia of scholarship. Now that I'm trying to get an understanding of where the just war theory, what's intended, what's double effect, or whatever he's talking about, it seems to me that just war doctrine is unclear, confusing, archaic, non-normative. It's archaic. Of course, the United States is making biological and chemical weapons all over the world. We know that. So what is all this about war crimes? You can't do it. What good is all this talk? What good are these rules, right? They're archaic, right? They're archaic. Every war involves the killing of civilians. It's not like we go out on a battlefield with a couple of, swords or something and duke it out away from a city. It just doesn't work that way anymore.
But at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 90% of the casualties were civilians.
So in the war as a whole, 66% of the deaths were civilians, not intrinsically evil. But with those two bombs, 90% is intrinsically evil. So what about 85%? Intrinsically evil or not?
Which makes sense because the bomb was dropped on the center of the city. One document from the Truman Archive says, all major factories in Hiroshima were on the periphery of the city and escaped serious damage. At Nagasaki, plants and dockyards at the southern end of the city were left intact. Another memo recommended that the bomb be used on a dual target, that is, a military installation or war plant surrounded by or adjacent to homes or other buildings most susceptible to damage, and that it be used without prior warning, end quote.
My understanding is that the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki was actually intended for another city. I can't remember its name. I think it starts with a K. But it was too clouded over. Something happened with the engine, so they had to go to Nagasaki. And I don't think that was their original plan. I'm surprised that Trent Horn doesn't mention that the target, the place that the bomb was dropped in Nagasaki was Urakami Cathedral, which was the center of Christianity in all of Asia. And the man who dropped the bomb was a Christian. So that's a whole nother layer that we have to think about here. If the just war doctrine is such that only war of defense is justified and wars of aggression are not, you cannot have both sides fighting defensively, can you? So which side was right? Which Christians were right? Why are Christians dropping bombs on other Christians? I mean, I hate to ask obvious questions here, but something's wrong. Something's really, really wrong there. And if we have to talk about that, we have to face that. Oh gosh, it's getting late. I'm still battling at my computer. Perhaps the approximately 10,000 generations that have passed since Homo sapiens came on the stage are not enough time for this relatively new species to get beyond imitating and nurturing the violent survival techniques of its pre-human past. Perhaps this inability fosters in a God-aware creature the need to create God in the image and likeness of what the creature is seemingly hermetically trapped in at the moment. Perhaps this inability to break the cycle of imitative violence motivates an ethically conscious creature to call the destruction of its own species good. But again, it is not at all clear how humanity became almost universally committed to a violent theism. What is clear is that Jesus confronts this idea head on and rejects it as emphatically as is humanly possible. He proclaims its opposite unequivocally. Love your enemies. He refuses to live according to its demands. Put up your sword. He enters into death not with fangs bared, but with love for those with fangs bared. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Jesus the Christ is the mystery within the mystery of existence, which offers to the human being and to humanity a choice to imitate its violent animal ancestors or to imitate its non-violent divine ancestor. The mystery called Jesus also offers humanity the reason for following him. Since the individual person and humanity in general cannot serve contradictory masters, Jesus inherently compels a decision from those who meet him.
While some leaflets warning of bombings had been dropped previously on Japanese cities by U.S. aircraft during the war, it's unclear if the residents of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were warned. But some leaflets did use the atomic bombings as a means to coerce the Japanese to surrender. Here's what one of them said. America asks that you take immediate heed of what we say on this leaflet. We are in possession of the most destructive explosive ever devised by man. A single one of our newly developed atomic bombs is actually the equivalent in explosive power to what 2,000 of our giant B-29s can carry on a single mission. This awful fact is one for you to ponder, and we solemnly assure you it is grimly accurate. We have just begun to use this weapon against your homeland. If you still have any doubt, make inquiry as to what happened to Hiroshima when just one atomic bomb fell on that city. Before using this bomb to destroy every resource of the military by which they are prolonging this useless war, we ask that you now petition the emperor to end the war. So we see here the bombs were used to incite terror and move the Japanese people to pressure their leaders to end the war.
Kind of like the bombings our government called shock and awe campaign in the early 2000s.
That's terrorism, and it's wrong. The second argument is that the atomic bombs were not weapons that indiscriminately targeted civilians. People say that the destruction they caused was on par with other conventional bombs that had been used in previous Japanese air raids. Now, the Catholic philosopher Ed Feser says the following in his reply to George Weigel's use of this argument. He writes, Weigel also notes that the constraints on the bombing of cities set by the just war tradition of moral reasoning had been breached long before the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So what? This proves only that those earlier bombings were wrong too, not that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not wrong, end quote.
More Christian churches than are probably willing to admit base their justification for participating in war and other forms of killing on some natural law philosophy. They refer to it as the just war theory or the right to self-defense by means of homicide. So let us first be honest about the relationship between Jesus and all justified homicide theories. These theories, including just war theories, owe nothing to anything Jesus ever taught or did. Jesus taught a way of nonviolent love of friends and enemies, period. Nor can the just war theory be found in the Old Testament. The justification for homicide in the Old Testament is that God supposedly commands it, either by direct communication, e.g. the genocide of the Amalekites, or by communication through the Torah, e.g. the stoning to death of a stubborn and rebellious son. Deuteronomy. The theory of just war with its criteria of just institution, just cause, just means, proportionality, last resort, non-combatant immunity, etc. is the work of philosophical speculation, not revelation in any ordinary sense. It begins in earnest with pagan natural law philosophers, Cicero, and later is adopted by Christian natural law philosophers. It is a work of human reason. Parenthetically, it should be stated forthrightly that Jesus does not commission his church to teach philosophy. His great commission is, "Go therefore, make disciples of all nations, baptize them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teach them to obey all that I commanded you." But what a work of human reason natural law Christian just war theories are. There are many of them, and they are all literally amazing. Taking care to avoid the maxim, "the first casualty of war is always truth," they step by step intellectually walk Christians through a logical maze that may or may not have any relationship to reality. This contortion allows the baptized, with blinding logical clarity, to arrive at the conclusion that they can do good in conscience what Jesus refused to do, and what he taught his disciples to refuse to do. Whether it be the Catholic Thomas Aquinas or the Protestant Paul Ramsey, the power of mind behind each theory and application thereof is breathtaking. The problem is, to use the words of the late biblical scholar John L. Mackenzie, behind all just war ethics one sees the cornered rat with its fangs bared. Did Christ come so we could act like cornered rats? It would seem that, at least for the Christian, the debate on whether a disciple of Christ can engage in mass homicide under some philosophical theory of just war would be closed. Christ, in fact, did not come so his followers could act like cornered rats with fangs bared. The picture of Jesus blazing away at other human beings with his Uzi submachine gun, the Uzi being just a technological extension of bared fangs, is so ludicrous that no one could seriously entertain such an image. Yet, if one is to believe the talk heard from the pulpit and the pew, at least 95% of Christians believe they can kill in war and still be faithful to Jesus. How is such bold contradiction between the master's teaching and the disciples' practice morally possible? How, in good conscience, is it sustainable? One way the utter inconsistency between Jesus of the New Testament and the justification of Christian participation in war is propagated and sustained is by ignorance. Christians, Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant, are not taught the truth about the phenomenon of war by their moral leadership. If a person thinks cocaine is no more destructive than sugar, then he or she will have no problem developing an ethic that justifies the sale of cocaine to children. Church leaders who have espoused just war theories have refused to expose beforehand the realities of war to their people. They have thereby kept their congregations ignorant and desensitized to the brutal logical, psychological, emotional, and spiritual contradictions between the way Jesus taught and the simplest act of war, e.g., slicing a person's head in half with a battle axe or a sword. Another way the inconsistency between Jesus and natural law just war theory is obfuscated and therefore sustained in conscience is by discovering certain principles of natural law that are then made equal to or superior to the explicit teaching of Jesus. On the surface, it would seem to be self-evident that if Jesus is God incarnate, the definitive revelation of God's will, the self-revelation of God by whom all things are made, then there would be no incompatibility between what Jesus taught and the imprint of God's providential plan on the natural reason of people, to use Thomas Aquinas' understanding of natural law. It would also seem self-evident, or at least unquestionably reasonable, that if the Christian discovered natural law principles that were inconsistent with Jesus' teachings, he or she, as creature before creator, would bow to the wisdom of God incarnate and accept that his or her reasoning process was flawed. But alas, such is not the case where natural law Christian just war theory is concerned. Here the Christian mind saddled, as all minds are, with a minuscule perception of reality, with a history of participation in sin, with disordered desires, with concupiscence, etc., makes itself and its interpretation of the will of God superior to the mind of Christ and to the will of God as revealed by Jesus in the Gospels. Then, based on its interpretation of natural law, it does in the name of God what God incarnate refused to do when he walked on earth, namely kill other human beings.
Another argument is that the civilian population was fair game because Japan planned to mobilize all of them to fight the Allies. American General Curtis LeMay defended widespread carpet bombing by saying this: "The entire population got into the act and worked to make those airplanes or munitions of war, men, women, children. We knew we were going to kill a lot of women and kids when we burned a town. Had to be done.
The Japanese government had mobilized a large part of the population into a national militia which would be deployed to defend the home islands.
But as Fazer notes, Japanese civilians had not yet been mobilized to be soldiers at this time, even if there were a plan to do that in the future. They were just civilians going about their daily lives amidst a conflict they had no responsibility in causing, so it was unjust to directly target them. Imagine also if the Japanese or the Nazis had used this argument to justify bombing or sending biological weapons against American civilians. They might say the entire U.S. population was mobilized to fight the war, so U.S. civilians were fair game. A child collecting scrap metal or a mother tending her victory garden were no different than a soldier about to leave for Okinawa or Normandy. If we consider that reasoning to be a specious defense of a war crime, then we have to make the same conclusion about the atomic bombs that were used in Japan.
It seems to me that operationally the principle of natural law is employed by just war moralists to validate the Christians' audacity in overriding Jesus' express teaching of nonviolent love of friends and enemies is this: survival is the first law of nature. Stated in other words, the protection of being is a law of being. It is obvious, for example, if a rat's survival is threatened, the rat will do all it needs to do with its bared fangs to assure it continues to exist. The natural law just warist says that the human being, by divine design, is granted the same rights as the rat, namely to do whatever he or she must do to survive. The just warist then goes on to point out that it's God who placed this desire to survive, to protect being, to continue to be rather than not to be in rats and in humans. This right to self-defense is not just a law of nature, but also designates a rule of conduct that proceeds from human nature as rationally ordained by God. Therefore, to live according to it, and if necessary to kill according to it, is to live according to God's plan, that is, the natural law. The just war theory, i.e. the right to lethal self-defense, is simply a set of logical standards to determine when survival is actually threatened and what lethal means are in conformity with God's will under what circumstance, e.g. how much collateral damage, that is, how much killing of non-combatants is proper in God's eyes in a particular case. But the ingrained principle from which all logical gymnastics of all the Christian just war theories operationally spring is survival is the first law of nature. This principle carries within it a great deal of logical elasticity. Without breaking an intellectual sweat, scholars can make it cover a legion of states deemed necessary for human survival, e.g. survival of low gasoline prices, survival of ethnic or national honor, survival of an economic system, survival of some ruling class system, survival of a political system, survival in positions of power and prestige, survival of comfort, survival of the standard of oppression to which one has become habituated, survival of geographical, racial, religious, or economic dominance. But whatever the particulars may be, behind all just war theories lie the desire and law of survival. When survival is threatened, what otherwise would be blatantly evil, e.g. homicide and arson, is called good by natural law just war theory. In other words, vice is virtuized and the diabolical is divinized. And yet Jesus says, "For anyone who wants to save his or her life will lose it, but anyone who loses his or her life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it." What a statement! What natural law just war philosopher or theologian could believe it? It totally contradicts the just war interpretation of the principle, survival is the first law of nature. It says if you try to save your life by acting like a rat with its fangs bared, if you start destroying others to save your piece of the pie, you will lose everything. It says that it is not survival but destruction that comes from the bared fangs and from the barrel of a gun. It says that to witness to the truth of Jesus and his gospel of nonviolent love of friends and enemies is the way to save one's life, even if it costs one's life. Who can believe it? Few have.
Finally, there's the argument that the bombs were necessary to prevent greater loss of life that would have come from an invasion of the Japanese mainland. Now, I've already shown that this argument fails because it relies on the false moral theory of consequentialism. If you justify the atomic bombing simply because you want to save the most number of lives, then you open yourself up to justifying a whole host of other evils as well in the name of things like utilitarianism. But another reason to be skeptical of this argument is that there's good reason to think the bombings were not necessary to end the war. After all, the Japanese refused to surrender even after attacks on other cities, attacks that were more destructive than the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. Why would we think that the bombs would cause them to surrender in this case when they had weathered far worse attacks?
It was only the dropping of the atom bombs that allowed the emperor and the so-called peace faction in the Japanese government to negotiate an end to the war.
It's also a fallacy to assume that Japan's surrender was due primarily to the atomic bombings that took place a few days earlier. Declassified documents show that the Japanese were more demoralized by the Soviet Union's declaration of war and their surprise invasion of Manchuria, an area of China that Japan controlled. That was the element that made them consider surrendering. Now, one of Japan's sticking points in a surrender would have been their desire to keep their emperor as the head of state. In his autobiography, the U.S. Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, said, "It is possible a clearer and earlier exposition of American willingness to retain the emperor would have produced an earlier ending to the war." And Admiral William Leahy, the chief of staff to President Truman, an unofficial second in command during the time of the bombing, later wrote the following in his autobiography. "It is my opinion that the use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender because of the effective sea blockade and the successful bombing with conventional weapons." End quote.
The late Catholic biblical scholar Reverend John L. Mackenzie describes the Christian just war theory as a phony piece of morality. A piece of phony morality. Rarely do Christians who espouse it discuss publicly the gossamer presuppositions on which it is constructed. For example, if, as is universally acknowledged, truth is the first casualty of war, if politicians, government functionaries, and military officials ceaselessly lie during a war, how can a Christian determine what the facts are in order to properly apply the just war standards? How? How can he or she know if just means are being employed, if the cause is just, if continuance of the war is just, if the criterion of proportionality is being adhered to, if non-combatant immunity is being honored? How? If truth is the first casualty of war, how can a person even know if the war is justly instituted, which is a requirement of the Christian just war theory? The Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which is the law that brought death to tens of thousands of Americans and millions of Vietnamese, as well as the physical and or psychological maiming of millions of other human beings, was procured by a Lyndon Johnson lie, by an event that never happened. In fact, a history book so large that the whole world could not contain it could be written about wars initiated and justified jus ad bellum on the basis of non-events. Lies. If truth is the first casualty of war, the Christian just war theory is fatally flawed because it is morally impossible to apply. To contend that a presupposition of veracity should be granted to a government's statements about its war is to argue that all apples are oranges, is to argue contrary to the documented reality of interminable duplicity by power politicians and military leaders at war. It is to play the intellectual and moral ostrich in the face of murder. It is to ground a Christian moral theory of mass homicide in the flim-flam of concocted falsehoods and unverified claims. It is to patently concede that the activities of war, jus in bello, cannot be continuously scrutinized and authentically monitored for their moral acceptability, a necessary requirement in all Christian just war theories. The fact is, Christian just war theory is now and always has been a fanciful theological house of cards that has always been and will continue to be blown down by every political wolf that huffs and puffs the mantras of erotic nationalism. What is tragic and pathetic is that Christian leaders continue to make believe that the house of cards is as solid as a rock spiritually. It is this calculated inattention to reality, to mendacity, to glaring absurdity, to unwanted truth that is the hallmark of that form of Christianity that self-reverentially identifies itself as realistic, and therefore in the eyes is morally authorized to adopt one or another of a just war theory as a way of overriding the expressed teachings of the unrealistic Jesus. 52 million people die in World War II. 48% of them are civilians. However, the American Catholic hierarchy, the Japanese Catholic hierarchy, the Italian Catholic hierarchy, the English Catholic hierarchy, the German Catholic hierarchy, etc., completely miss it. Yet non-combatant immunity from being killed is an irremovable standard of the just war theory. The realistic overseers of most of the other churches experience a similar failure of elementary perception during World War I and during every other war of the 20th and 21st centuries. This obliviousness to the obvious is part and parcel of just war Christianity for 1600 years. Christian just war theory is a ruse by which Christians in the pulpit and in the pew try to salve their consciences for not having enough faith in the nonviolent Jesus to follow him and his way of nonviolent love. The Christian just war theory might better be designated the Christian just war caper, an artful dodge whereby Christians try to fool themselves and the whole human community by morally rubber-stamping homicide in the name of Jesus on behalf of their particular kingdom. Christian just war theory is a mental mirror game, where one Baroque logical mirror is placed before another Baroque logical mirror, with the net result being a dazzling display of logic that appears to be clear and of infinite depth. The only catch is, it's all done with mirrors reflecting each other. Its depth is illusionary. It reflects almost nothing of the reality of war, and it reflects absolutely nothing of the Jesus of the Gospels.
One thing motivating the bombings may have been a desire to pay back what happened at Pearl Harbor in 1941. President Harry Truman seemed to insinuate this kind of attitude when he announced the bombings in a broadcasted speech.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold, and the end is not yet.
One magazine poll taken 2 months after the war ended showed that 1 in 5 Americans wished that more atomic bombs had been dropped on Japan before they surrendered. This shows that millions of Americans viewed the bombs primarily as a retributive punishment for the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and only secondarily as a deterrent to stop the war. But we shouldn't retributively punish civilians for something that happened in a war. And this debate isn't about something that just happened 80 years ago. It's about the broader principle of respecting human life, even in the hell that is war.
I think it should be about the broader principle of human beings and Christians substituting something that's just human reason and philosophy for the explicit teachings of Jesus. I think it should be about the just war theory, the just war doctrine, whatever you want to call it. That's what we should be talking about here.
We have to be careful about allowing war to destroy what is good in us and turning a desire for justice into a lust for vengeance.
Here, the Christian mind, saddled, as all minds are, with a minuscule perception of reality, with a history of participation in sin, with disordered desires, with concupiscence, etc., makes itself and its interpretation of the will of God superior to the mind of Christ and to the will of God as revealed by Jesus in the Gospels. Then, based on its interpretation of natural law, it does in the name of God what God incarnate refused to do when he was walking on earth, namely kill other human beings.
Or letting war destroy us entirely. The argument that the atomic bombs were necessary to save more lives overall, that argument becomes difficult to make because now what if atomic bombs could destroy humanity entirely? Think about all of the nuclear scares that we faced since the dawn of the Cold War.
In a world where the pandemic of justified homicide is treated with the theological placebos, let us try to fathom, by use of an analogy, the gravity, the unnaturalness, and the impossibility of trying to cure or arrest this disease by prescribing that particular placebo known as the natural law Christian just war theory. We have all seen large propellers on an airplane rotating so rapidly that the human eye cannot detect that they are present. If the revolutions per minute are high enough, the circumference of the area through which the propellers are passing thousands of times per minute appears empty and transparently clear. This is, however, a deadly illusion. If one walks into this area, one is ripped to pieces. A legion of people could argue that there is no reason to worry, since it's perfectly clear and there's nothing present that could cause injury. However, the concrete reality of individual beings being torn apart, one after another, would invalidate all abstract thinking on the subject. But what level of self-deception, what level of callous, self-righteous folly, what level of atrophied empathy to human misery would it demand in order to continue to insist upon the truth of one's abstract conclusion that, quote, there's nothing present, unquote, when person after person walks into the area and is sliced to pieces? This is precisely what church leaders do when they continue to ignore the fact that there is something blatantly contrary to natural law that is required by so-called natural law Christian just war theory. To actually participate in a war, whether it is named just or unjust, one has to destroy divinely implanted constraints that are at least as innately powerful as the divinely implanted constraints against incest. However, no one and no society overrides inherent natural law blocks against incest or human bloodletting without being torn to shreds by the invisible propeller of evil that these constraints are meant to protect people from. The theological sugar pill of natural law Christian just war theory is powerless to combat or to heal the consequences of going where God forbids us to go. If anything, its illusionary spiritual assurances promote the very pandemic it claims to be trying to prevent and cure.
Here's an interview with one of the bomb's most famous creators, J. Robert Oppenheimer, who was portrayed recently in the film Oppenheimer, describing how he and others justified their work on the atomic bombs. As you watch the interview, note the tears welling up in his eyes as he talks about the justifications and the implications of this dreaded device.
And that on the whole, we were inclined to think that if it was needed to put an end to the war and had a chance of so doing, we thought that was the right thing to do. We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
The ultimate deception of evil, says the renowned Jewish theologian Martin Buber, is that it leads people to believe that they can control it once they have chosen it. Nowhere is this more true than when a person, and by extension when a society, chooses homicide. Marshall's studies make visible a powerful restraint mechanism that communicates to the individual, even under crisis conditions, the warning, don't inflict death. Jesus explicitly places an equally chilling caveat before humanity. Put up your sword, for the one who lives by the sword will perish by the sword. The artistic mind of Aesop unmasks the same truth. Both natural law and the gospel raise a red flag that reads, don't kill. They raise it because homicide, being contrary to the eternal law implanted in the human heart, always leads individuals and societies into unexpected, uncontrollable, and often irreversible realms of spiritual, psychological, and social contamination and defilement. In short, it is an iron law of the moral universe that evil, once let loose, has its own propagating energy. Hence, as sure as a farmer must reap corn if he sows corn, the unnatural will beget the unnatural, will beget the unnatural ad nauseum and possibly ad infinitum. The history of Christian homicidal violence, if examined empathically and studied rigorously, in the way that scholars can study such matters, will bring to light a plethora of savage and ruthless behaviors so antagonistic and so contrary to the life envisioned by the gospel that only an intrinsically distorted reality could have produced them. Participation in that perverted and perverting reality is what natural law Christian just war theory condones, spreads, and tries to pass off as holy.
Recently, Pope Francis has questioned whether any war can be called a just war. And while the principles of nations defending themselves from legitimate threats is always a valid expression of just war theory, I agree with Eric Sammons from Crisis Magazine that often when we try to apply just war theory to modern conflicts, the justification falls flat. He writes the following: although one could still try to argue that our original attack on Afghanistan was justified in light of 9/11, the expansion of the conflict and its ongoing nature clearly violated just war theory. And this is the one U.S. conflict in my lifetime that best fits the just war theory. The second Iraq War was a disastrous foray of foreign interventionism and score settling. The various U.S. bombings in the Middle East over the years, such as in Syria, clearly violate just war principles, end quote. As I said before, war is hell. It's not glamorous. It's not cool. We should honor those who fought for our freedom in wars precisely because of the horrors they endured. And we should never choose to intentionally inflict those horrors on innocent men, women, and children who never signed up to face them in the first place.
If Jesus is the Redeemer, why doesn't the world look more redeemed after 2,000 years? Asks the entire non-Christian world. The answer is self-evident for those who have eyes and wish to see. The kingdom of God can only be brought about by the means of the kingdom of God. Not one speck of evil, I would add intrinsic or regular, not one unchristlike act, not one act of homicidal violence is needed for the kingdom to come in all its fullness. To abandon the nonviolent Jesus is to abandon the means that the nonviolent word of God communicates to humanity as the means by which the kingdom, reign of God, is to be established.
Well, I hope that today's episode was helpful for you, and I hope that you have a very blessed day, and I hope that you will pray for peace in our world. Thank you all so much, and have a blessed day.
I will do that, Trent, and thank you. I don't know if I doubt you'll ever see this, but in the event that you do, I hope this doesn't come across as like a personal attack or anything. I'm just speaking out loud with what I'm thinking when I'm hearing this conversation, and I just feel like there's a really big piece that's missing. But I would love for you to cover this again. I noticed that this is one of the lower view counts on your channel, and I think that's interesting that you went out there and you did this, which is such an important topic, and it seems like there's just not a lot of interest in it. Anyway, I hope that doesn't discourage you from covering these topics in the future. I certainly would be eager to hear more of your take on just war theory if you ever wanted to cover that. And in the event that you ever do see this, I'm running a retreat with Father McCarthy. I really recommend his books. I hope that you'll go read them. I'd love to hear your critique of them or your comments on them. The Just War Theory, Logic of Deceit, and All Things Flee Thee, for Thou Fleest Me. And if you want to come to my retreat, it would be an honor to have you there to listen to Behold the Lamb. I know it's a long shot, but I have to send you an invitation. And also I have to tell you, I love your wife. I love her channel. She is hilarious. And I would love to be friends with her. I just think she's great. So anyway, thanks for everything that you do on your channel. I do enjoy watching you, and always appreciate your takes on everything. I really do. God bless. And to all of you who are listening and watching, that was a long one, but hopefully you got something out of it. See you next time.